Newness, Originality and Idiosyncrasy in Kant's account on artistic production. Beautiful art is the art of genius, Kant writes in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. The primary characteristic of genius is its originality. Originality is therefore a part of a talent and gift, since genius is the talent which gives the rule to art. Also, the notion of genius appears to be old-fashioned or pathetic. It is a fruitful concept for Kantian thought, since it has a systematic function. I suggest to read it as a cluster of capacities which a finite rational being exhibits in its engagement in a particular context, which is aesthetic production. Especially interesting about genius is first that in genius lies the capacity to set rules in a situation where no rules do apply, and second, that genius unites particularity with universality. When I use the phrase ingenious artist in the following, I refer to someone who regularly produces extraordinary beautiful art, which are artworks that arouse immense aesthetic pleasure, since they prompt the free play of imagination and understanding in a particular vivid and lasting way. Since there is no recipe for the production of beautiful art, it is worth to shed some light on how originality as the primary characteristic of genius can be coherently understood. Since genius, I quote, consists in the happy relation which no science can teach and no diligence learn, end quote, the only way artists can learn to produce great art is by following an example. While Kant describes this as emulation, Nachfolge, by drawing from the same sources from which the example itself drew and learning from the predecessor only the way to behave in doing so, he doesn't positively describe aesthetic originality. We learn that imitating the originality of an ingenious artist gives rise to a school. But it seems to remain vague what exactly is meant by originality. My main claim in this lecture is, which I'm going to defend, is that Kant understands originality in an aesthetic sense as an artist's ability to express something personal in a communicable way in the medium of art. I will begin by examining the negative definitions of unoriginal art, imitation and mannerism. Since originality is defined as non-imitation, neither of form nor of content, the second step of my argument consists in the hypothesis that originality could be applied to the fine arts by identifying it with the exhibition of entirely new ideas. To be original could mean to use new materials or to invent a new subject or style. Having rejected mere novelty as a proper feature of fine art after Kant, I thirdly pursue the alternative, that originality lies in particular, highly personal stances which can be termed idiosyncrasy and identified with the expression of the sensus privatus. At this point, we must draw some distinctions between exemplary originality and simple originality, briefly address the discussion about the thin and the thick concept of genius, and make some clarificatory points about the particular aesthetic terminology, especially concerning the notion of spirit. Spirit turns out to be the transcendental and enabling reason of original artworks, while idiosyncrasy is the empirical, socio-historical root and source of originality. But in order to produce a beautiful work of art, which prompts aesthetic judgments that claim to be universally valid, idiosyncrasy must be transformed or translated. Finally, since originality cannot consist in the illustration of general concepts, I come to the conclusion that originality is based on the making communicable of what is idiosyncratic in the artwork. Its mediation between the highly personal, or what really matters to the artist or speaks to her or him, and the universal communicability makes the work of art transcend the personal towards the subjective universal. I prepared an argument map which we can use for the discussion later on. And I also want to say something to the drawings and painting I'm using in my presentation. They are all from a collection of so-called art brut, or also called outsider artists. That means that these works are works of untrained artists or non-professional artists, and some of them are even patients in mental hospitals. For example, there's one drawing from someone who has autism. These works express idiosyncratic perspectives which might not be intelligible to rationality in cognition, but they succeed to express universal validity in the medium of beautiful art. I come to the first section. Sorry. Imitation and mannerism. There are many passages in Kant's critical philosophy in which Kant distinguishes someone who imitates the exercise of capacities like thinking, willing, and judging, but doesn't really think, act, or judge for himself. Well known is the passage from the Architectonic in the first Critique, where Kant writes about who has properly learned a system of philosophy and remains a plaster cast of a living human being. Imitation here means the mere reproduction of a content that has been learned. In the Enlightenment essay, Kant opposes imitation, reproduction, and following an authority with the active engagement of thinking for oneself. To think for oneself is not only the content of the imperative sapere aude, make use of your own reason. Think for yourself is also the first rule of the common sense, gemeinschaftlicher Sinn, as the autonomous way of thinking. To think for oneself means firstly to actively engage in acts of thinking as an individual person, and secondly to really think in the full sense of thinking, which includes, besides following the rules of general logic, also engaging in the practices Kant describes as applied logic, such as attention, abstraction, inquiry, German Untersuchung, and reflection, German Überlegung. To think for oneself means to be the imputable author of one's own judgments, which includes not only the articulation of one's position, but also their original development. This requires to become aware of one's own dark representation and transform them into clear and distinct concepts. The notion of thinking for oneself can be opposed to the mere reproduction of thoughts of other thinkers, as well as the articulation of prejudice. The self-execution of thought is characterized by its independence from the guidance of other thinkers, and affords, following the Enlightenment essay, effort and courage. Nevertheless, thinking for oneself is not arbitrary, but complies to the laws of reason. The three rules of common sense mutually refer to each other. Thinking for oneself includes, because of the robust concept of thinking, to think from the standpoint of anybody else and to think in accordance with oneself. All of these are expressions of Kant's notion of personally imputable but intersubjectively universally binding reason. In the case of the production of art, the artist has to massively engage in the autonomous way of thinking, but not quite in the same way. It is true that imitation is especially problematic for impractical knowledge that can't be taught but must be trained, because there is no other proper use of this faculty than the active and authoritative engagement in the first person. Judgment can't be delegated. Accordingly, the reflecting power of judgment is, I quote, a special talent that cannot be taught but must only be practiced. But since intellectual agency is based on the cooperation of the faculties, it is a problem for all mental activities that aim at valid claims. In this sense, Kant states in the Anthropology that the imitator in morals is without character, for this consists precisely in the originality of the way of thinking. He draws from a source of his behavior that he himself has opened up. That is why the man of reason cannot be an eccentric. Indeed, he never will be, because he is based on principles that apply to everyone. For aesthetic judgment, Kant holds that It is required of every judgment that is supposed to prove the taste of the subject, that the subject judges for himself, without having to grope about by means of experience among the judgments of others, and first inform himself about the satisfaction or dissatisfaction in the same object, and thus that he should pronounce his judgment not as imitation. Because a thing really does please universally, but a priori. For the production of art, Kant writes in the beginning of paragraph 47 of the third critique, everyone agrees that genius is entirely opposed to the spirit of imitation. The special problem with the production of art is first that Kant's description of drawing on one's own rationality in the broad understanding is too abstract to explain what aesthetic originality is and how or if it differs from the talent to bring about a beautiful form in general, and second, that thinking for oneself is not enough for the production of art. I quote, "But even if one thinks or writes for himself and does not merely take up what others have thought, indeed even if he invents a great deal for art and science, this is still not a proper reason for calling such a great mind a genius, since just this sort of thing could also have been learned, and thus still lies on the natural path of inquiry and reflection in accordance with rules, and is not specifically distinct from that which can be acquired with effort by means of imitation." In mannerism, Kant describes a case in which someone pretends to be original, but aims to copy the very appearance of originality. Mannerism is another sort of aping, namely that of mere individuality, originality in general, in order to distance oneself as far as possible from imitators, yet without having the talent thereby to be exemplary at the same time. At first glance, this passage could mean that an unoriginal artist does not copy another artist's work directly, but merely adopts his or her style, since mannerism is also the title of an art historical period from the late Renaissance to the early Baroque, for which it is typical that the artist develops an individual manner or style. But correctly interpreted, Kant here addresses the case that someone feigns originality. In another section, Kant illustrates feigning originality with intentionally parading with a horse with the staggers, which bears reference to the lack of discipline and training. Now, since the originality of his talent constitutes one, but not the only essential elements of the character of the genius, superficial minds believe that they cannot show that they are blossoming geniuses any better than by pronouncing themselves free of the academic constraint of all rules, and they believe that one parades around better on a horse with the staggers than on one that is properly trained. On the one hand, this passage shows that simply breaking academic rules is not a sufficient expression of originality. But on the other hand, it is not clear from this passage alone that originality itself involves following an order, for some regularity could be brought into the picture by the other qualities of genius to which Kant refers, which might bring originality into a form that conforms to existing rules. As a final result, from these negative descriptions follows that originality draws from a source that the individual subject has opened up for themselves, but still relates somehow to universality and can be distinguished from the talent to be exemplary. Furthermore, the artist should not imitate neither form nor content, and also not originality itself. Second section, originality as novelty. What is the exact opposite of a copy? It is the production of something no one has done yet. In this line of thought, Paul Geier claims that Kant's theory of genius is a theory that successful art is always in some way or other current, novel art. End quote. It is true that genius has a lot to do with invention and novelty, since genius can be systematically interpreted as the one who gives a new rule to art. Nevertheless, it is not clear, I quote Kant, what sort of rule is this? It cannot be couched in a formula to serve as a precept, for then the judgment about the beautiful would be determinable in accordance with concepts. The non-conceptual nature of beauty goes back to the combination of two of its conditions. First, to the character of reflecting judgment, which is a judgment that, starting from particular cases, recognizes the general under which these given particulars can be subsumed. The second is the subjectivity of the aesthetic judgment. If we judge a beautiful object, we are not addressing certain features of this object, but what it does to us. It prompts the free play, causes aesthetic pleasure, and makes us request approval for our judgments from other spectators. Therefore, there is no recipe to produce a beautiful object, no formula to serve as a precept, like Kant puts it. But rather, the rule must be abstracted from the deed. That means from the product against which others may test their own talent, letting it serve them as a model, not for copying, but for imitation. How this is possible is difficult to explain. The ideas of the artists arouse similar ideas in his apprentice if nature has equipped him with a similar proportion of mental powers. The models of beautiful art are thus the only means for transmitting these to posterity. Kant here draws a distinction between copying and imitation. Copying is the exact reproduction of a style or manner, while imitation can be read in a more general sense. The latter may concern imitating the logic of an artwork, its implicit assumptions about what kind of art it is, and even more broadly, the imitation might concern how to make an artwork in general, or even how to be an artist. From this metaphor of emulation, Nachfolge, and the above-mentioned passage about parading with a horse with the staggers, it becomes clear that Kant doesn't understand originality as a negation of academic rules, which great artworks after Kant exhibit, because every art presupposes rules which first lay the foundation by means of which a product that is to be called artistic is first represented as possible. Historically, there have been many academic rules to art. In painting, for example, there are theories about the harmony of colors, basic rules about the texture and application of color, rules about the color of light and the color of shadow, rules about proper perspective and composition. Moreover, what is represented and how it is represented corresponds to a network of codes and meanings. If an artist follows these rules accurately, the result may well be a perfect and yet perfectly boring painting. Furthermore, Kant claims, while art is always something made, it must not look like something made, but should appear to be natural. This doesn't mean that in a Kantian understanding of art, only naturalistic or even hyperrealistic art can count as beautiful art. It rather means that it shouldn't be possible to grasp how it has been made. What Kant calls die Schulform shouldn't be easy to identify, since this would bring the free play of aesthetic judgment to an abrupt end. Therefore, novelty can't be understood as a complete negation, but rather as divergence from the academic rules of art established so far. Following Kant's hylomorphic distinction between form and matter, an artwork can be new in form or in matter. Moreover, the notion of matter includes the subject of the artwork, that what it is about. Different from free natural beauty, there are concepts involved in artistic beauty, what doesn't mean that an artwork is an illustration of such a concept, but that certain concepts should be involved in the free play. If we understand originality as aesthetic novelty, an original artwork would therefore be a piece that has, first, a form in the Kantian sense of proportions of shape, pitch, or sound no other known artwork has, or second, is made of materials which has never been used, or third, deals with a topic that has not been introduced to art before. For example, Georgia O'Keeffe and Andrei Rublev did not invent novel subjects. The first came up with a novel manner of painting flowers, simply put, The second followed the rules of icon painting strictly, but increased the level of sensitivity and emotion that lifted his work beyond icon painting before him. For novelty as a matter of content, Louise Bourgeois' works might serve as an example, since she is one of the first who made psychoanalytic insights a subject of art. But Bourgeois also introduced new materials to the art world. Nevertheless, it is clear that the beauty of these works is not based on their novelty only. Novelty alone is not sufficient to arouse aesthetic pleasure, because it alone doesn't prompt the free play. The pleasure we take in novelty in art is similar to the surprise over perfection, which Kant distinguishes from beauty, or the respect we have for someone who invented an app, for example, that sells very well, if we have respect for such things. Moreover, Newness doesn't prompt the free play of an universal spectator. In the beginning of the era of aviation, many painters chose to make airplanes to central subjects in their work. And yet, some years ago, there was a trend to 3D print sculptures just because this technique was new. Those works don't mean anything to the spectator in a universal sense. So, art is not about innovation and progress. And now I have a quote from Robert Pippin. No one credible could claim that our default assumption should be that Ibsen must be a better playwright than Shakespeare because he wrote later, or that Shakespeare must be better than Sophocles, and if we do not see such progress, there must be something wrong with playwriting, end quote. While we prefer to be operated on by a doctor of the 21st century rather than by a doctor from antiquity, we enjoy great art from antiquity just as much as great contemporary art. To be fair, also, if the production of art following Kant is not about novelty, it might be the case that novelty contributes to the arousal of aesthetic pleasure if it furthers the free play. For example, if someone makes an artwork from seaweed and eggshells, and nobody has done this so far, this might be particularly beautiful because the material or the assemblage prompts on a symbolic level more thoughts than any concept could express, like Kant characterizes aesthetic ideas. Nevertheless, in these cases, the aesthetic value doesn't stem from novelty, but from the free play that it prompts. Third section. Originality as idiosyncrasy. The remaining opposite of imitation is the absolutely singular. Since the absolutely singular would not be anything to us because it would not comply to the categories, originality could be at least drawing from the own sources in an individualistic way as a personal expression, which is when it is articulated as a manner, the idiosyncratic. To clarify if originality can be identified with idiosyncrasy, we have to engage in the irritating, seemingly incoherent distinctions between bloße Eigentümlichkeit, originality simpliciter, and exemplary originality, mustergültige Originalität. I quote Kant. That since there can also be original nonsense, products of genius must at the same time be models. That is, exemplary. Hence, while not themselves the result of imitation, they must yet serve others in that way. That is, as a standard or rule for judging. Exemplarity surely consists in the suitability of the artwork to be used by others as a model to follow. But the combined notion of exemplary originality instead of exemplarity and originality as two distinct characteristics of genius strongly suggests that exemplarity is a determination of a certain kind of originality. Against this, Kant sometimes uses the first term in a combined expression only in order to underline a certain already included aspect, like in universal communicability, where universal doesn't specify communicability since every communicability is universal. In favor of this, it can't be claimed that every artwork that prompts the free play is beautiful and therefore might serve as an in favor of this, the difference, it can be claimed that every artwork that prompts the free play is beautiful and therefore might serve as an example, at least concerning those aspects which make the artwork arouse aesthetic pleasure. Then every originality in art is always already exemplary. Against this speaks that we neither call every beautiful artwork an ingenious artwork, nor do we judge every expression of originality as original nonsense. Originality as the feature that what makes the productive aspect of an artwork valuable without making it into the work of a genius, like the invention of a new subject, should therefore not be identified with exemplary originality. Furthermore, since an art piece can be original but must not be nonsense, therefore, originality simpliciter can be distinguished from idiosyncrasy. Nevertheless, to count as beautiful, material content-related originality needs to be brought into or be mediated through a form which enlivens the mind. At this point, we have to take up the problem of the so-called thin and thick concept of genius. It concerns the question if genius, which is original, additionally must be tamed by taste to become exemplary original, but is already genius just because of its originality. Originality is the sufficient condition of genius in the thin reading. This means that there are ingenious artists who don't produce beautiful art, since they lack training and taste. In other words, very talented but lazy artists. Following the thick reading, all genius to count as ingenious always already must be exemplary, original in the first place. In line with this, Kant states that taste is even more important to beautiful art. Note, not ingenious art, than the imagination, to which Kant refers to as the primary source of genius here. Quote, if the question is whether in matters of beautiful art it is more important whether genius or taste is displayed, that is the same as asking whether imagination or the power of judgment count for more in them. Now, since it is in regard to the first of these that an art deserves to be called inspired, but only in regard to the second that it deserves to be called a beautiful art, the latter, at least as an indispensable condition, conditio sine qua non, is thus the primary thing to which one must look in the judging of art as beautiful art. The thin and the thick reading both have textual support. The oscillation between thin and thick conceptions of genius is due to the different and in themselves already differentiating conceptions of genius before Kant. One way of resolving the textual tension is to understand genius in paragraph 46 as a disposition or talent, but to read genius in paragraph 49 as a designation of the person itself, according to a note in which Kant distinguishes between having genius and being genius, as Robert Clues suggests in his book from last year. Sorry. One side is missing. No, it's here. It's here, sorry. So, while I find it convincing for a coherent understanding of the text, the systematic question if taste necessarily constitutes genius to realize its proper aesthetic, not general, originality remains. Taste surely is a necessary act in the process of judging, because judging beauty, and a fortiori must be exercised many times during the production of an artwork. As a finite rational being, every artist possesses taste as the faculty to reflectively judge the beautiful. Genius as a person in the thick reading possesses taste too, for that very reason, but not necessarily in a higher proportion than any other finite rational being. We can discuss this. What I find particularly puzzling here is, If aesthetic originality as the very productive aspect of aesthetic production necessarily needs not taste, because the taste is a negative faculty for judging and not for production, but the reflecting power of judgment as a guideline in the production in order to create a beautiful form. Most Kant scholars claim with textual support that imagination is the most relevant capacity for genius. And it does play a crucial role. In Kant's list about the ingredients of beautiful art, I quote, "For beautiful art, therefore, imagination, understanding, spirit, and taste are requisite. Imagination is seen to stand for the productive side, while understanding and taste curb the flights of fancy and bring discipline and order into the imagined manifold to render it aesthetically digestible." Now, isn't it puzzling, since the artist produces what prompts the free play, arouses aesthetic pleasure, and demands of the reflecting power of judgment to state, "This is beautiful," that the reflecting power of judgment shouldn't be involved in the very process of creation in a more productive sense of that what later is judged as beautiful. If imagination is the only productive faculty in the process of artistic creation, this would mean that imagination suggests a form and taste either accepts or rejects. I want to call this the brute force attack of artistic production, since it is based on a technique of trial and error. Like an algorithm blindly tries a multitude of passwords to get into a secured system, the artist's imagination suggests a multitude of forms which taste thereafter judges. Imagination is productive but blind, I quote, "For all the richness of imagination produces, it is lawless. In its lawless freedom, nothing but nonsense." Therefore, the production of art would follow an entirely negative method in excluding what is not beautiful from what is. That seems not an appropriate description of the phenomenology of artistic practice, but also not of genius, since the spectator has taste too. And the distinction between an ingenious artist following the thick concept and an original but average spectator would diminish. The riddle, if there is room for a productive, spontaneous but guiding element which is capable to positively create the universally valid aesthetic form for the original, is mentioned in what I called Kant's list of ingredients that I just quoted. For beautiful art, therefore, imagination, understanding, spirit, and taste are requisite. Spirit is literally very close to genius, since ingenium is the Latin word for spirit. The concept of spirit can, it is argued here, be understood as a summarizing title for the living dynamics of reflecting judgment, empirical and transcendental imagination, discursive takings, and ideas of reason. The passage that follows the definition of spirit in the aesthetic sense is very complex. Kant writes, "Spirit, in an aesthetic significance, means the animating principle in the mind. That, however, by which this principle animates the soul, the material which it uses for this purpose, is that which purposively sets the mental powers into motion. That is, into a play that is self-maintaining and even strengthens the power to that end. Now I maintain that this principle is nothing other than the faculty for the presentation of aesthetic ideas. On the one hand, spirit can be understood as interplay between the aesthetic power of judgment, the figurative, transcendental, and the empirical imagination. Furthermore, since in beautiful art concepts are involved in the free play as well as in the aesthetic ideas, understanding and reason count into the material of aesthetic animation too. On the other hand, Kant also uses the concept of spirit as a title for the impulse that triggers this interplay. With this interpretation, the position presented here deviates from readings that discuss the relevance of reflecting power of judgment, above all in the question of the significance of taste for genius. It also departs from the position that attempt to trace Kantian aesthetics of production back to the interaction of the imagination and the understanding, or with reason. Therefore, I claim that spirit must already include an inverted use of reflecting judgment that consists in acknowledging a priori the pattern of the beautiful or the idea of the reflecting judgment in the singular. In exactly this way, spirit is described in the anthropology as the principle of the mind that animates by means of ideas. Taste is a merely regulative faculty of judging from the combination of the manifold in the power of imagination. Spirit, however, is the productive faculty of reason which provides a model for that a priori form of the power of imagination. Model is the translation by Robert Loudon and Manfred Kühn for Muster in the German original. In the German original, it reads, Geist legt der Einbildungskraft ein Muster unter. Muster has a double meaning as a model and as a pattern. Patterns are regularly not recognized on the basis of conscious conceptual judgment, but on the basis of unconscious associations of the similar. This is one of the reasons the ingenious artist can tell what she is doing. Spirit explains the reason why the ingenious artistic subject has the ability to establish new rules of art production. This is so because it creates an exemplary mirror to the intersubjective dynamics of finite rational beings, which present the finite rational being in its own vitality. The aesthetic judgment of beauty creates the evident feeling of a correspondence or fit. Initiated by the principle of spirit, the proportion of the aesthetic productive faculties correspond to the mood of mind on the part of the receiving subject, into which the latter enters in a state of aesthetic pleasure. Aesthetic pleasure is the sensation of the promotion of vital forces. I quote Rudolf Mackrel, aesthetic pleasure intensifies the sense of my existence, furthers my feeling of being alive. It follows from this that the difference between original nonsense and exemplary originality has a second possible source. Like mentioned before, it can be caused by an error in taste, as the disciplinary faculty in the judgment of the beautiful, but it also can be due to a failure in the process of original production, because the artist failed to positively recognize and find the pattern of the beautiful. In other words, she or he is uninspired. Concerning the relationship between originality and spirit, I want to suggest here, before we return to idiosyncrasy and communicability, that spirit is a cluster term for the transcendental grounds of the productive aspect of artistic creation, in other words, for originality. The complexity or doubling of the function of reflecting power of judgment in my reading stems from the interconnectedness of form and content in art, which inserts an accelerating dynamic into Kant's dichotomic hylomorphism. After what has been said, the difference between originality simpliciter and exemplary originality amounts to the difference between purely material or discursive originality, newness, novelty, innovation, as originality simpliciter, and inspired aesthetic originality on the other side, which includes the positive finding of the beautiful form already in the process of production. Therefore, aesthetic originality, including a positive form-finding capacity, is exemplary originality if it reaches a certain degree of intensity, which it does in some ingenious artworks, but even not in all works of so-called geniuses. Spirit is the answer to aesthetic originality as a transcendental ground, but spirit is not the answer for the material source for originality or how originality is informed. One might compare this to the relationship between the transcendental apparatus and the object. In the very first sentence of the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, Experience is without doubt the first product that our understanding brings forth as it works on the raw material of sensible sensations. It is for this very reason the first teaching, and in its progress it is so inexhaustible in new instruction that the chain of life in all future generations will never have any lack of new information that can be gathered on this terrain. In the following, I want to argue that originality simpliciter and exemplary originality both draw massively on idiosyncrasy as a source. But if they should not end up in original nonsense, the idiosyncratic must be transformed into something which is communicable. According to what I said before, originality can fail in two ways and become original nonsense. Firstly, in criticism, in the aesthetic judgment of what is produced in the judgment of taste. Secondly, in the production of that unity of beautiful form and inspired content, which Kant calls the aesthetic idea. Because the reflective power of judgment is not in itself a productive power, but a regulative principle, it draws on imagination as productive faculty to represent an object without its presence. The discipline and training an artist needs to produce great art is needed because the capacity to express a perspective affords the mastery of the materials, and it affords to bring order in the very vivid imagination of the artist. The extraordinary vivid imagination brings the ingenious close to the madman. In the Anthropology, Kant describes the dangers of imagination. The offenses of the power of imagination are that its inventions are either merely unbridled or entirely ruleless. The latter fault is the worst kind. The former inventions could still find their place in a possible world, in the world of fable, but ruleless inventions have no place in any world at all because they are self-contradictory. Ruleless fantasy approaches madness, where fantasy plays completely with the human being, and the unfortunate victim has no control at all over the course of his representations. The capacity to express a thought rests on the mastery of the medium, and to grasp a thought properly, imagination and concept need to be balanced, for the concepts give meaning to the image and to intuition. Strong imagination and the capacity to produce works of art that arouse immense aesthetic pleasure are closely linked, not only because a vivid imagination is innovative and creates extraordinary forms and fascinating, astonishing forms enliven the imagination of the spectator because they create many associations, and also the above-mentioned wow effect that perfection and problem-solving evoke. Moreover, there is another connection between imagination and originality via idiosyncrasy and the power to translate. To translate the personal into the subjective universal, which goes beyond grasping one's own dark and blurry representation and beyond the capacity to express one's thought. Imagination as the capacity to intuit an object without its presence is also one condition of communication and empathy, because it enables us to think from the standpoint of anybody else. At this point, I find Hannah Arendt's interpretation of the sensus communis very helpful. Arendt writes, "The sensus communis is the specifically human sense because communication, language depends on it. To make our needs known, to express fear, joy, etc., we would not need language. Science would suffice. Communication is not expression." Arendt here refers to Kant's Anthropology, where Kant says, "The only universal characteristic of madness is the loss of common sense and its replacement with logical private sense, sensus privatus. For example, a human being is in broad daylight, sees a light burning on his table, which, however, another person standing nearby does not see, or hears a voice that no one else hears. For it is a subjectively necessary touchstone of the correctness of our judgments, generally, and consequently also of the soundness of our understanding, that we also restrain our understanding by the understanding of others, instead of isolating ourselves with our own understanding and judging publicly with our private representations, so to speak. This touches the actual meaning of the term communicability, which doesn't mean expression only, but involves the claim of agreement, Zustimmen, that Kant refers to when he writes allgemeine Zustimmung, Ansinnen about aesthetic judgment. To be communicable in that very sense means to mean something to others. The singular and personal, like our particular perspectives on the world, our private sensations, our subjective associations, and self-made theories about connections, must be translated. Translation is possible in two ways. First, it must be grounded in objective reasons in the case of knowledge, and therefore must be transformed into conceptual thinking and objectively valid claims. Or second, it must be articulated in the language of art via the beautiful form, by the reflecting power of judgment. I claim in constructive and disciplinary versions, which is subjectively universally valid. Therefore, the difference between originality and idiosyncrasy lies in their communicability. A work of art, to become aesthetically original, must be made intelligible for other minds. It must be accessible for the realities and experience of other people. They must be capable to relate to it in a strong sense. I come to the last section. Fourth, idiosyncrasy transformed. It's a very short section. Originality as communicability of the personal. If art is about communication of the universal, why wouldn't it be sufficient to already start from universals like laws and just express them in a beautiful way? My claim was that Kant understands originality in an aesthetic sense as the ability of an artistic subject to express something personal in a communicable way in the medium of beautiful art. The reference to the personal might appear mislead. What is personal about a beautiful painted still life or a portrait of Jesus Christ? The reference to the personal in an explicit sense is clearly at odds with the examples Kant gives of artworks. It contradicts the commonly shared experience of art too. We not solely experience autobiographical, therapeutical, or autofictional art as beautiful. We do, and examples might be autofiction by Tracy Emin, Adrian Piper, Deborah Levy, and Maggie Nelson. But we also judge works as beautiful, such as abstractionist paintings and classical novels, which seem to cut short on the individual experiences, which, by the way, seems to be a failure of judgment, since what counts as universal in art is a product of history and culture. Nevertheless, this is not the same notion of the universal that Kant claims. Therefore, personal shouldn't be understood too narrowly as autobiographical, but more in the meaning of the slightly pathetic but beautiful words of Emerson, who writes, I read the other day some verses written by an eminent painter, which were original and not conventional. The soul always hears an admonition in such lines. Let the subject be what it may. The sentiment they instill is of more value than any thought they may contain. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. This is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense. For the inmost in due time becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. The illustration of general laws or common concepts are not aesthetically interesting because there is no free play, but only cognition in the sense of, oh, this artwork is about X. This is not to say that art which starts in the personal couldn't be boring too. It is, in the case that it only illustrates personal narratives. In the section about humanioria in paragraph 60, Kant says artists should study ancient literature. My host today, Larissa Berger, recently argued that this study enables artists to create artworks that arouse sympathetic feelings because emotions can contribute to the enlivening of the aesthetic ideas. Before the artist is capable to express emotion, she or he should be able to consciously acknowledge and experience emotions in the first place. Therefore, the artist must be first sensitive in noticing what is within her or himself, what she feels like, and second, what forms and colors make him or her feel, and then thirdly, find the form and colors which are capable to express these feelings. In my reading, this recognition of the form is the function of the reflective power of judgment. But not only feelings must be recognized, but also standpoints and narratives which describes these standpoints, perspectives and convictions she or he has. This is meant by the metaphorical description of finding one's own voice. Furthermore, artistic practice is not only the work of a lifetime because it requires the mastery of the materials, but also because it is hard because it is hard work recognizing what is going on and what matters. Gaining authenticity can be a very emotional process, since there are no rules and therefore there might occur a loss of control, acquaintance with vulnerability, struggle, failure, and discomfort. The experience of the resistance of art, its autonomy, not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense that the artwork becomes a living thing on its own, the uncontrollability of its unfolding, and the experience of translating feelings into communicable aesthetic ideas makes artistic practice a transformative process. I come to conclusion. Originality is not about novelty, although new materials, new subjects, and new forms can further the free play. Originality is not the same as idiosyncrasy because idiosyncrasy lacks subjective universality, which is the central characteristic of the beautiful. Nevertheless, idiosyncrasy, meaning perspective, sensations, associations, subjective connections, and representation, belongs to the central sources of beautiful art because other than the illustration of objective reasons or scientific knowledge, it prompts the free play when it is translated into a communicable form. To give an example of original, formerly idiosyncratic art, I want to address Maria Lasnik's body awareness paintings. Body awareness seems to be extremely personal. They count into the realm which Wittgenstein held to be uncommunicable. Lasnik proved him wrong since she managed to make them communicable in the medium of painting. This fits neatly into Kant's notion of communicability as Mitteilbarkeit. Mitteilbarkeit is the transgression of the realm of the individuum into the realm of the other. Against this, the artwork stays idiosyncratic if it fails to address something the other can relate to appeal to the other, to affect and concern the universal aspects of the other by expression of the particular is exactly what constitutes an artwork's power to arouse aesthetic pleasure. Aesthetic pleasure, here I agree with Rachel Sackert, Moran Goddess Riccitelli, and Larissa Berger, is an intentional pleasure that is directed towards remaining in the state of pleasure, to linger on beauty. Beyond that, I think that aesthetic experience is about the experience of expanding and transgressing boundaries between oneself and the other, find yourself in the other, but it is also of trespassing of our own self, own horizons, and feeling and cognition. Thank you very much.